was Herod, and was he great? That's what we're going to talk about today. Hi, this is Jill from the North Woods, talking about Bible topics. Help us to know a little bit more about the world of the Bible and what it is we're supposed to be doing. Today's going to be a little bit more about history. Herod was a known figure, and he would have been a known figure if the Bible was never written. He was a friend of Cleopatra, and his father was a friend of Julius Caesar. He got appointed along with the other son of Antipater, that was the father. Faisal was to rule Jerusalem, and Herod was to rule the Galilee area. And then, I'm not going to go into the whole Hasmonean thing, but the Hasmoneans were the Maccabees who kicked out the Greeks. There was a lot of political intrigue. Rome wanted sole control of this area, and Herod brought it about. And he was appointed then king of Israel, instead of being tetrarch, which is just one of the four. And now he's ruling. And the Sanhedrin and other people found him to be ruthless. He was ambitious. He did a lot of building projects, but he was absolutely brutal and had good relationships with the Romans, which a lot of people felt was at the cost of the people there. I think it would be easy enough to say, well, if he didn't, you would have a Roman leader there and they would be much more cruel to him. Now, he was an Edomite, and the Edomites were people in southern Israel. Think about Jacob and Esau. But there was also a mixture of people from Syria as well, and those are the Nabateans. They are really interesting people. Someday we'll talk about them on their own. But he maintained his power by aligning with Mark Antony. When Mark Antony had his fateful end, along with Cleopatra, made deals with Augustus Caesar to keep his place. He was known to be extremely paranoid, killed his wife, Miriam, several of his sons, and he was just a very paranoid individual. His wife was someone he married to tie himself to the Hasmonean dynasty. Like I said, those are going to be the people, think Hanukkah, the people who overtook the Greeks and won the temple back. And that's why we celebrate Hanukkah. That's the Hasmoneans. That's a very loose generalization. But the Bible references towards Herod is that he slaughtered innocents in Bethlehem. He tried to coerce the Magi to give him information about the Messiah and if they find him or not. And then our last reference to Herod in the Bible was Herod's death, which was in Jericho. And the angel tells Joseph to return from Egypt because now Herod is dead. And Herod died somewhere in that 4 BC area. And the reason that Herod also is very well known, besides having very high and powerful friends in the Roman and Greek world, was the fact that he was an amazing engineer. He built massive structures. When I was in Jerusalem, there were parts there that I got to touch, I got to see, that were part of Herod's building. Part of the western wall of the temple structure was him building the temple reconstruction that was started in the Old Testament. He was going to finish it. And it did finish somewhere around 65 AD. I've been to Masada many times, and it's stunning. And there's a whole story there. We'll talk about that in some other episode. Several other fortresses and retreat areas, military strongholds that he built. And like I said, the Masada was a desert fortress. It's built on, I guess, what we would call a mesa in the United States. But it's this very tall tower that comes up and then flat at the very top. And up there were storerooms, there were ritual baths, there were all sorts of things. This was going to be just a fortress for him. Like I said, paranoid, so he wanted to have these strongholds. Jewish rebels took it over in 73 AD, well after his death, but that was going to be his. Then he built something called Herodium. This is a palace fortress in an artificial hill, and this is also believed to be where Herod was buried, and has palace gardens, pools, and an underground escape tunnel. And then he built this prison that John the Baptist was eventually imprisoned in and executed. So good things, bad things. He also built the port city of Caesarea. And this is going to be Caesarea that is on the coast. It is beautiful. You can still see the amphitheater still in place. In fact, Yitzhak Perelman, who's a famous violinist, was playing there when I was in town. I didn't get a chance to see him because I didn't have that kind of money, but you could see the harbor. This was a major place where the Romans brought supplies and people into Judea. And like I said, you go there, it's beautiful. And it's amazing because he built that as well. And then he built something that was called the Antonia Fortress. This was inside of Jerusalem. This was meant to be a stronghold. It had military barracks in there, and that it was a place where meant to hold Jerusalem, like a fortress inside of Jerusalem to make sure there was no uprising there. Chances are, then when Jesus was brought before Pontius Pilate, he probably was brought there. Some people think it was a different location. In fact, it was the location where I stayed at a convent, but chances are it probably wasn't at that convent location. It was over there in the Antonia Fortress. Then he built something that was called the city of Sebaste, that's in Samaria. And again, it was another Roman city, ancient Samaria, and he was trying to gain favor with Rome and the local Samaritans. It has huge columns going down the street, and there was a Roman forum there and a temple dedicated to Augustus. Whoops. So there is various other places. And then inside Jerusalem itself, there was an upper and lower palace. And Pontius Pilate, when he took over, eventually made these palaces his offices. It was beautiful, huge stones, and again, there were places that you can still see today. The lower palace, that's the place where I was at, and that was going to be the place where Pilate questioned Jesus. So Herod's architecture is well known. It was based on Roman and Greek styles. He was trying to do like a little political balancing act, but he also built the temple. He knew that if he built the temple, that people would admire his dedication to God. Being a high leader and then throwing your people a bone and saying, well, I'll tell you what I'll do for you. I'll build you a temple. Now, he was raised Jewish, and so he was Jewish, even though he probably ethnically was not Jewish, or at least maybe was ethnically part Jewish. The Edomites became Jewish somewhere in the 2nd century BC. And like I said, there was a very complicated history between him, Cleopatra VII, the Cleopatra we know, and Mark Antony. Mark Antony, obviously real person, friends of Julius Caesar, but you also think about the play from Shakespeare that was friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your, that's Mark Antony. So Cleopatra was a friend to Herod. Cleopatra was an ally and a girlfriend of Mark Antony, and Herod supported Mark Antony. He owned his entire kingship to Mark Antony and then later Octavian. He was declared king of the Jews. Cleopatra sometimes saw Herod as a rival. You know, when we were trying to get favor from Rome, she would have loved to expand her Egyptian control all the way up through Judea. It happened before in the past, places where Egypt was in control of Judea. She would have loved to do it again, but as a strong king in that place, she wouldn't be able to do that. But he ended up helping her when she needed it the most, when she was under siege and trouble from Rome itself, despite the fact that she tried to get Mark Antony to give her the land of Judea. Obviously, he wasn't going to do that. In Jericho itself, he built a palm grove that had dates on it, and Cleopatra wanted to get control of Jericho because of this very valuable dates that was used for perfume and balsamic products. She wanted that area, and it's also a very fertile area, so she wanted control over it. So instead of losing the land outright, Herod became almost like a tenant of Cleopatra. So they leased back from Cleopatra this land, basically meaning that he paid her for the rights to rule what was really his to rule. This was his area. Now, it said, even despite the fact that this book I read, who knows, claimed that they were friends and he helped her at the very end, Herod resented Cleopatra, obviously, because he had to pay money to her for leasing his own land in Jericho. He wanted to remain on good terms with Antony, but obviously with Cleopatra having such a hold on Mark Antony, that was going to be very hard to do. And so he openly tried to defy Cleopatra and sway Mark Antony to give him back his own land. I mean, obviously this is going to be a tug back and forth. And it said that in Josephus, Herod even considered assassinating Cleopatra when she visited Judea, but decided not to because of Mark Antony's influence, I guess. So what happened is in 31 BC, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Octavian, died in sort of a mysterious murder-suicide or double suicide. And their deaths in 30 BC, then Herod immediately switched sides. And immediately at 30 BC, when they died, Herod switched sides, convinced Octavian, who's Augustus, Caesar Augustus, he would be a loyal Roman ally. And Augustus awarded Herod not only with letting him be king, but returning all the territories that Cleopatra had taken away from him. So were they friends? Were they enemies? Were they frenemies? Yeah, I mean, he never could probably say what he really thought of Cleopatra, primarily because she held such sway over Judea and held such sway over Mark Antony. He outlasted and won the day. So then Herod, let's just talk about some of his rule inside of Israel. He's rebuilding the temple, right? Everyone wanted the temple back who was in Judea. This temple was supposed to be the temple of God, and it was destroyed. And they wanted it back. They wanted it rebuilt again. And this was started way back in the Old Testament, and he started rebuilding this temple. He established then the Sanhedrin makeup. The Sanhedrin are going to be basically 70 Jewish ruling council that are made up of Pharisees and Sadducees and are responsible for the religious rule inside of Judea, because again, Samaria is a different territory. And in this case, he took control of a very weak Sanhedrin and replaced most of the members. He was himself what was called a Sadducee. And a Sadducee believed in the first 5 books of the Torah. They did not believe in the prophets. So, I mean, you lose Isaiah, you lose all the Messiah prophecies, and every other prophecy that happened about Israel and what was to come. They didn't believe in an afterlife. Everything was here right now. And like I said, just they were all law and no prophecy. And that's what he believed. And so he really structured the temple structure to be made of these Sadducees. And the Sadducees, because they were, I don't want to say they're less religious, they had less religion to be adhered to, they were not like the Pharisees. The Pharisees and the Sadducees hated each other, fought with each other. Sadducees were more willing to make deals with the Romans than the Pharisees were. So it led to a smoother rule. It allowed him to do basically what he wanted in building this deal with the Romans, taxing purposes and all the other pieces of it. So in that particular case, he really structured the Sanhedrin after himself. This all started somewhere around 37 BC, and he actually went through and executed most of the members of the Sanhedrin who opposed him. Like I said, they opposed him because he was cruel, but they also probably opposed him because of the deals he was making with Rome. He wanted a more compliant Sanhedrin, and that's what he got. Basically, a Sanhedrin that would rubber stamp anything that he wanted. He took control over the high priesthood. The high priest was part of the Hasmonean priestly line, and Herod broke that tradition and appointed the high priest at will. He removed Hyrcanus from the high priest job. He appointed outsiders, drowned Hasmonean prince, who was his own brother-in-law, because he proposed a threat through the temple structure. Herod's Sanhedrin manipulation means that the Sanhedrin lost a lot of power to Herod and eventually to Rome. So they did not have the strength to do a lot of the ruling that they used to do. The Sanhedrin still existed at the time of Jesus, but it was mostly them trying to get Rome to do what they wanted and trying to get Herod's successors to do what they wanted. So this was a total restructure of it. And so while we can say in this particular case that Herod died in 4 BC, and his influence on the life of Jesus had to do with the poll that was being taken where they had to travel to Bethlehem. It had to do with the killing of the innocents and causing Jesus' family to flee to Egypt and then eventually come back. And it put this structure in place of, like I said, the Sanhedrin, the deal they had with Rome, and the temple that was being reconstructed throughout the life of Jesus. So while Herod does not play himself a big part in the life of Jesus other than when he was a very young boy, he is the backdrop. Everything that got set up is the backdrop to Jesus in Jerusalem. And while Herod was a political survivor, very savvy. What did Herod do when he heard the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem? He got scholars, smart people all together so they could figure out where he was coming and what he was going to do. Now, he was going to kill the Messiah if he was going to be born during his time, because only one person could be in charge, and that was Herod himself. He was very wise. He put heavy taxation on his people, both for his army and for the Roman army and for the Roman taxes. And he ensured that a lot of tribute money went to Rome. So he didn't rebel, and he basically created a tight structure between his rule and the Roman rule inside of Jerusalem. They both profited, both Rome and himself, from the taxes. He had a world-class army. And so most of the time when we see military people inside of Israel, they were Herod's army. They weren't Roman army, because he was capable of brutally crushing any uprising, defending his own land. The Romans, who are spread throughout the entire Mediterranean, didn't want to waste valuable resources putting Roman soldiers in a place where they weren't needed. Herod had it all under control. So mostly when we see soldiers and centurions and those kinds of things inside of the Bible, those are going to be Herod's army, Herod's military. So that was because he was a strong man, right? And he was able to do that, although we do see some places where there were Roman soldiers around. But there were some places, too, where Herod fought for his Jewish identity. He did not want Roman gods inside of the temples and places in Jerusalem. He did not want his face to be put on Jewish coin because the Jewish law said you don't have graven images, which means that throughout much of the art that we see in historic Judaism, it never was of people. It was always a fish or symbolism, but it was not people because you don't have graven images. Now, most of us as Christians tend to believe the prohibition against graven images was not worshiping graven images, not just having paintings of people. But still, he kept the Sanhedrin under tight control. So while he was Jewish, he did some things that were Jewish. He looked for the Messiah that the Jews were looking for and then looked to kill the Messiah. He still had that mix of Rome and Judaism built inside of him. But I think that also allowed him to be a bridge between the Roman culture and the Jewish culture. I think to the extent that the Jews were allowed to keep their culture, worship God, and keep the Sanhedrin in place and other documents in place had to do with the fact that Herod was a strong leader and he did defend his faith to a point. And he did defend his faith. So they didn't get completely overrun, even though he was, to an extent, a Roman puppet. But what about his children? Like I said, he executed his wife, Miriam, and put 3 of their sons to death for expecting that they were plotting against him. Augustus reportedly said, it's better to be Herod's pig than his son. a brutal statement, knowing that Jews were not allowed to eat pork. So, but he'll kill his children, but he won't kill a pig, is the basic idea. And the end of Herod was grisly. He died somewhere in 4 BC, and it was described as very gross. It was a long, painful illness. Some people felt it was gangrene, which made some sense. Other people thought it was an STD, which also made some sense. And then other people said it was probably kidney failure. But it was a painful death. And his funeral was huge. It had gold and spices and soldiers in procession. He was probably, like I said, buried at Herodium. And his tomb was discovered in 2007 by an archaeologist. They were searching for it for decades. So the sons that he killed was Antipater II. That was the heir to his throne, his eldest son, executed in 4 BC, 5 days before his death. Alexander and Aristobulus, who were children through Miriam, also executed for treason. There's no reason to believe that there was treason. They just were executed, and that was somewhere around 7 BC. The sons that live were Herod Archelaus. He was going to become one of the tetrarchs of Judea, Samaria, and Edom. That's going to be Herod's homeland. And he was brutal and incompetent. He was so bad that the Jews and the Samaritans basically petitioned Rome to remove him. And he was banished to Gaul in 6 AD. I mean, it's pretty bad when the very people you're subjugating get to say, that guy, he's real terrible. Herod Antipas is the one that we're most familiar with. He ruled as the Tetrarch of Galilee in Luke's Gospel. He built Tiberias, which is a town. He married Herodias, which would also be his niece. That's going to be his brother's wife. So he took his brother's wife, married her, stole the daughter along with her because she was a good dancer. And this was the criticism that John the Baptist gave against him that eventually led to the execution of John the Baptist. But again, he wasn't a leader. He struck me as very uncurious because at some point he says, who is this Jesus guy? Is that just John the Baptist? I thought I killed that guy. He just sort of struck me as someone who was uncurious because his father would have gotten experts to go figure this out, but he didn't really care that much. He even said, I'd like to meet that guy, and he never did. Later, in 39 AD, Emperor Caligula, who was also not a great person, exiled him to Gaul, which would be France, I believe. There was Philip the Tetrarch, which means one of the fourth, and he ruled the northeast territories of the area. And he was actually known to be peaceful, competent, and he was the only one who had no rebellions, no exiles, and he just died in 34 AD. So probably the best of the rulers. There were some other children in there. There was going to be Herod Philip I, who was the husband to Herodias before she was stolen. He was not mentioned in the Gospels. He was not a ruler, and he was just sort of mentioned as context of where basically the wife came from. Their daughter Salome, yeah, that was the daughter who did the dancing. There were some other children that were mentioned, but none of them really came to anything that we mostly knew about in history. I mean, the Herod family really was a Game of Thrones empire. Political heirs murdered, political marriages, backstabbing, going to this person and that person. But you know what? Herod the Great, he outlasted. You know, they say that in Survivor, outlast, outwit. He did all of that, mostly because he was smarter than all of his children. And then even what we know of Herod Agrippa is going to be his grandsons, Herod Agrippa I and Herod Agrippa II, ruled Palestine during some of the New Testament era, so we hear something about them as well. So like I said, the reason to know about the Herod family is, first of all, they are very famous in history. But again, Herod the Great didn't influence the adult life of Jesus, but he developed the backdrop. He made everything that we see, the temple, the structures, everything that we see, the places where Jesus was interrogated, all Herod's work. He provides this backdrop of the life of Jesus. I guess he built the set, and his children were just terrible kings. But he's an interesting figure. I don't think he is great. I think he was horrible. His buildings were great. And I got to see many of those buildings when I was in Israel. I was really pretty amazed. I have one of these things where if I touch a building, it just means something to me. Like I touched the buildings where Jesus was, or the places where Herod built this ark, or, over the roadway. I don't know. It's just kind of a funny thing. I had the same thing when I went to the Tower of London. But for me to go to Jerusalem and see places that Herod didn't build because he had people build them. But he instructed the building of it. He instructed archways and doorways and things that we see. Much of Jerusalem got rebuilt by the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And we can talk about that in another day. But there's still places there where Herod's buildings still stand. All right, everyone, I thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment in the chat. If you have anything to say to me, you're also welcome to email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. I appreciate you watching. Have a great week.